My autistic son was nonverbal, his world a fortress I couldn't breach. Then a new nanny arrived, and her quiet whispers to him began to reveal not his secrets, but mine. The silence in my house used to be the sound of failure. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that follows a storm. My son, Leo, is 7, and his world is a fortress I've never been able to breach. He's autistic and largely nonverbal, and his storms, the meltdowns born of sensory overload and overwhelming frustration, could shake the very foundations of this sprawling, empty mansion I'd built with my own 2 hands. I'm a man who deals in numbers, in acquisitions, and hostile takeovers. I can predict market trends and bend boardrooms to my will, but I couldn't decipher the intricate code of my own child. My wife Eleanor, she understood him. She spoke his language without words. A touch on the shoulder, a soft hum, the exact pressure of a hug she knew. But I lost her 2 years ago, and with her I lost the only translator I ever had. Since then, it's been a revolving door of nannies, each one more qualified and more useless than the last. There was the behavioral therapist who tried to implement a sticker chart system for a boy who didn't understand praise. There was the cheerful, bubbly woman who thought loud songs and bright colors would bring him out of his shell, sending him into a screaming panic instead. They all left, frustrated and defeated, whispering apologies about Leo being too challenging. Every departure felt like a personal judgment, a confirmation of my own inadequacy as a father. Then Clara walked in. She wasn't like the others. The agency sent her file over with a note saying she had a unique approach. She was in her late 20s, with quiet eyes that seemed to see everything, and a calmness that felt almost unnatural. Her resume was thin compared to the others. No fancy degrees, just years of experience with special needs children in less than privileged settings. I was desperate. I hired her on the spot. The first week was strange. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence I was used to. It was a gentle, settled quiet. I'd watched them on the security cameras from my office downtown. Clara never pushed. She never forced Leo to make eye contact or respond to his name. Instead, she'd simply enter his world. If Leo was lining up his blue dinosaur figures on the rug, she would sit on the other side of the room and line up red ones. She never spoke to him directly, not in the way the others had. She would just be there, a silent, steady presence in his orbit. The meltdowns lessened, first from daily occurrences to a few times a week, and then, after a month, they had all but vanished. Leo, who would flinch from most human touch, would occasionally let his hand brush against hers, as they both reached for a building block. He seemed content. It should have made me ecstatic. Instead, a knot of suspicion began to tighten in my gut. It was too good to be true. How was she doing it? What was this unique approach? My logical, cynical brain couldn't accept it. There had to be a trick, a method she was hiding. The day I found out was a Tuesday. I'd closed a massive deal ahead of schedule and decided to come home early. A rare treat. The house was, as usual, peaceful. I walked silently down the marble hallway towards Leo's sensory room, a space we'd designed with soft lighting, weighted blankets, and a bubbling water tube to be his sanctuary. The door was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack, expecting to see them sitting on the floor with his blocks, existing in their comfortable silence. But it wasn't silent. Leo was on the floor, intensely focused on clicking 2 magnetic tiles together. Clara was sitting a few feet away from him, her back against the wall, her posture relaxed, and she was whispering. Her head was slightly tilted, her lips moving in a soft, continuous murmur directed at my son. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was rhythmic, almost like a chant. Leo wasn't looking at her, gave no indication he was even listening, but his movements were calm, his focus absolute. A cold dread washed over me. What was she saying to him? Was she filling his head with nonsense? Was she some kind of cultist, whispering strange mantras to a vulnerable child? The protective fury that grips any parent rose in me, hot and blinding. I had to know what she was saying. My entire house was wired with the best security money could buy. My hand shaking slightly, I pulled out my phone, opened the security app, and selected the microphone for the sensory room. I pressed the button to listen in, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to hear, I don't know what. What I heard instead made the blood in my veins run cold. Her voice came through the speaker, clear as a bell, a soft and melodic whisper. And she wasn't talking to Leo. She was telling him a story, a detailed, intricate story about a brave knight. A knight who built a tall, lonely castle of glass and steel, who was powerful and respected, but terribly lonely. A knight who loved his little prince more than anything in the world, but had forgotten how to speak his language. She was telling my son the story of my life. I stumbled back from the door, my phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The wind knocked out of me. Every word she'd whispered was a tiny, sharp blade, expertly dissecting the armor I had so carefully constructed around myself. The lonely castle, the forgotten language, it wasn't just an observation, it was an indictment. She saw me, not the millionaire CEO, the titan of industry, but the failed father, the grieving husband rattling around in a house as empty as my heart. My initial fury was instantly eclipsed by a profound and terrifying sense of exposure. Who was this woman? How could she know these things? Had she been digging into my past? Interviewing my staff? The paranoia was a familiar comfort, a shield I raised against a world I couldn't control. I retreated to my home office, the one place that felt truly mine, all sleek chrome and cold leather. I sat behind my massive desk and tried to regulate my breathing, a technique one of those useless therapists had taught me. It didn't work. On the monitors, I watched her. She was still in the sensory room with Leo. After a few more minutes of her soft whispering, she simply got up and left the room, leaving him to play peacefully. There was no grand finale, no trick revealed, just a quiet exit. It was unnerving. This wasn't manipulation as I knew it. This was something else entirely. I waited, stewing in a cocktail of anger and confusion, until I heard her moving about in the kitchen, preparing Leo's dinner. I buzzed the intercom, my voice coming out colder and harder than I intended. Clara, my office. Now. She appeared in the doorway moments later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She wasn't flustered or afraid. She just stood there, her calm gaze meeting my glare. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice even. Is everything all right? Cut the act, I snapped, leaning forward. I heard you. In the sensory room. The story about the night. Her expression didn't change, but a flicker of something. Understanding. Maybe pity passed through her eyes. It only fueled my anger. Who have you been talking to? My security? My staff? Where did you get your information? She took a small step into the room. I haven't spoken to anyone, sir. Then how? I demanded, my voice rising. How do you know those things about me? For the first time she looked away, her gaze drifting to a framed photo on my desk. It was the last one I had of the three of us. Me, Eleanor, and a tiny Leo, all smiles on a beach that felt a lifetime away. I don't know things about you, Mr. Thorne, she said softly, her eyes returning to mine. I observe. I see a man who works 16-hour days building an empire, but comes home and walks on tiptoes so he doesn't disturb his son. I see a house filled with the finest things, but the only pictures on the walls are of a woman who is no longer here. I see a little boy who flinches at loud noises but finds comfort in the steady rhythm of a dishwasher. He doesn't need to be fixed. He needs to be understood. The stories, they aren't for you. They're for him. For him? I scoffed, though the certainty in my voice was wavering. He's nonverbal, Clara. He doesn't understand complex narratives. He doesn't need to understand the words, she insisted, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. He understands the intention, the rhythm, the feeling behind it. I'm giving him a narrative for his world. I'm turning the confusing, loud, scary presence of a grieving father into the story of a sad, brave knight who loves his prince. It gives him context. It makes his world feel safer. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. She was psychoanalyzing me to my son through fairy tales. It was the most ridiculous, unscientific, absurd thing I had ever heard. And yet, the results were undeniable. Leo was calmer. The house was peaceful. My logical mind screamed that it was a coincidence, a fluke. But the desperate father in me, the one who would do anything to connect with his son, was listening. "I don't believe you," I said, the words feeling flimsy even to my own ears. "I think you're a fraud." She simply nodded, accepting my verdict without a fight. "You're entitled to think that." "Prove it," I challenged, seizing on the word. "You're so confident in this narrative of yours. Prove to me that it works." Clara was silent for a long moment, studying my face as if she were reading the fine print of a contract. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken tension. I expected her to back down, to admit it was all a game. Instead, she looked at me with an unnerving clarity, as if she could see the exact shape of the hole in my life. "Okay," she said finally. "There is a way. But you have to do exactly as I say." I leaned back, my arms crossed. "I'm listening." Her gaze was steady, piercing. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to go into Leo's room alone. In the back of his closet, on the top shelf, there's a small wooden box. Inside is a little whittled bird. Eleanor made it for him." My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen that bird in 2 years. "He hasn't touched it since she died," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He won't let anyone near it. I want you to take the bird out of the box. Sit on the floor and just hold it. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him. Just hold it. And I want you to think about her. Really think about her. Let yourself feel it. If what I'm doing is working, if he's beginning to understand the night's sadness, he will come to you." The next morning the sun streamed through the panoramic windows of my bedroom, but it brought no warmth. Clara's challenge had echoed in my head all night, a maddening loop of skepticism and a desperate, flickering hope. The idea was ludicrous, a magical test of a father's grief, mediated by a nanny who thought she was some kind of child whisperer. It defied all logic, every principle by which I'd built my life. But the image of that small, whittled bird, a relic of a life I'd locked away, had burrowed under my skin. I hadn't dared to touch Eleanor's things, let alone something she'd made for our son. It was a pain too acute, a memory too sharp. I found myself standing outside Leo's door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I hadn't entered his room in the morning, alone, in months. Clara usually handled the wake-up routine, her quiet presence a buffer against the potential for sensory overload that a new day could bring. I pushed the door open. Leo was already awake, sitting on his circular rug, arranging a series of smooth grey stones into a perfect spiral. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I was just another piece of furniture in his world. Following Clara's instructions felt like performing a bizarre ritual. I walked to his closet, the scent of lavender and clean linen, Eleanor's scent, faintly clinging to his clothes. On the top shelf, behind a stack of blankets, was the small, unadorned wooden box. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. The wood was smooth, worn from Eleanor's hands. I lifted the lid. There it was. The bird was tiny, no bigger than my thumb, carved from a single piece of light-colored wood. It was simple, almost crude, but I could remember her sitting on the porch, a small knife in her hand, patiently shaving away slivers of wood, her brow furrowed in concentration. She'd said it was a sparrow, a symbol of joy and protection. At the time, I'd just seen a silly trinket. Now it felt like the weight of the world. I crossed the room and sat on the floor, a few feet from Leo, my back against his bed. My expensive suit felt stiff and out of place on the soft carpet. I held the bird in my palm, its familiar shape a painful imprint. Leo continued his work with the stones, utterly absorbed. Click, click, click. The sound was the only thing in the room besides my own ragged breathing. Think about her. Let yourself feel it. Clara's words were a command. I closed my eyes. For 2 years I had actively suppressed every memory, every feeling. Grief was a weakness, an inefficiency I couldn't afford. I had a company to run, a son to care for. I'd buried Eleanor under layers of work, meetings, and spreadsheets. But now, holding this piece of her, the dam I had so meticulously constructed began to crack. The memory of her laughter, a bright musical sound that used to fill this sterile house with life. The feel of her hand in mine, her fingers always cold. The specific way she smelled after a shower, like rain and citrus. It all came flooding back, not as individual memories, but as a single, overwhelming wave of loss. A hot sting pricked the back of my eyes. The night in the lonely castle. It wasn't a story. It was a mirror. The grief I had refused to acknowledge, the sadness I had deemed unproductive, was a physical presence in the room, choking the air from my lungs. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. In that moment, I let the cold, hard facade of Richard Thorne, CEO, crumble into dust. I was just a man who missed his wife, a man who had lost his way. The little wooden bird felt impossibly heavy in my hand. The quiet clicking of the stones stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I opened my eyes. Leo had abandoned his perfect spiral. He had turned his entire body to face me, his head cocked to the side. His deep brown eyes, which so rarely met mine, were fixed on my face. Not on my eyes, but on the tear track on my cheek. His expression was one of intense, unblinking curiosity. The look of a scientist observing a completely new phenomenon. My breath hitched. He had never, not once, willingly focused on me like this. His gaze was usually a fleeting, peripheral thing. This was different. This was direct. Intentional. Slowly, deliberately, he began to crawl towards me. It was an agonizingly slow journey across the rug. My mind was screaming. He's coming. It's working. She was right. He stopped just inches from my knees, his small hands planted on the carpet. His eyes flicked from my face down to my hand, to the little wooden bird nestled in my palm. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, he just stared. Then, with a feather-light touch that sent a jolt through my entire system, his small finger reached out and gently brushed against my own, right where it was touching the bird. It wasn't a grab or a poke, it was a point of contact, a connection, and then he did something that shattered my entire understanding of my son. He looked back up at my face, directly into my eyes, and he whispered a single, raspy, perfectly formed word. A word I hadn't heard him speak in over 2 years. Sad. The world tilted on its axis. He saw it. He saw my grief, my pain, and he had a word for it. A word he had learned from Clara's stories about a lonely night. It wasn't just a bond between nanny and child I had witnessed. It was a translation. Clara hadn't just been comforting him. She had been teaching him a new language, an emotional vocabulary to decipher the world around him, to decipher me. My mind reeled with the implications. What else had she taught him? What other stories had she told? I had to know everything. Later that day, after Leo was asleep, I found Clara in the library, tidying the shelves. "The bird," I said, my voice hoarse. It worked. He spoke. A small, gentle smile touched her lips. "I know. He has a lot to say." "Tell me," I demanded, stepping closer. "Tell me all the stories you've told him. I need to understand." She turned to face me fully, her expression becoming serious. "I will, Mr. Thorne. But you have to understand, the stories aren't just about you. They're about his whole world. About the angry wind that sometimes screams outside his window. About the scratchy monster that lives in his sweaters." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "And about the whispering queen, the one who carved him a bird and then had to sail away to the stars." My blood ran cold. The whispering queen. Eleanor. What did you tell him about her?" I asked, dreading the answer. Clara's voice was soft, but her words landed like stones. "I told him the truth. That she loved him very, very much. And that sometimes people who love us have to leave, even when they don't want to." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before delivering the final blow. "I also told him that she left a secret message for him, a final story, one that only he would be able to find when he was ready." A secret message? A final story? The words hung in the silent library, preposterous and yet impossibly compelling. My mind, the logical engine that ran on data and predictable outcomes, was short-circuiting. Eleanor was gone. There were no more messages, no more stories. This had to be a fabrication, a fairy tale Clara had invented to give Leo comfort, to give his mother's absence a narrative shape. "That's not possible," I said, the words coming out as a choked whisper. There was no message." Clara's calm expression didn't waver. "Are you sure, Mr. Thorne? Did you look everywhere?" Eleanor was a woman who understood stories. She knew they were more than just words. They're containers for love. Her question was a key, turning a lock I had sealed shut 2 years ago. I thought back to the weeks after she was gone, a blur of funeral arrangements and suffocating sympathy cards. I had gone through her things methodically, clinically, packing away the person she was into neat cardboard boxes. I had emptied her desk, her closet, her side of the bed. I had been thorough, efficient, desperate to erase the constant, painful reminders. But had I really looked? I spent the rest of the night in a feverish state. With Clara's quiet permission, I went into the attic, a place I hadn't set foot in since I'd stored her belongings. Dust motes danced in the beam of my phone's flashlight, illuminating a graveyard of my past life. Box after box labeled in her elegant script. College notebooks, travel souvenirs, old photos. I tore into them with a frantic urgency, searching for a letter, a diary, anything. But there was nothing. Just the ephemera of a life well lived, each item a fresh stab of grief. Defeated, I sank onto an old trunk, the dust-filled air thick with the scent of aging paper and cedar. It was hopeless. Clara had been wrong. It was just a story she'd made up. My gaze fell upon a smaller box, pushed into a corner that I had overlooked. It wasn't a standard cardboard moving box. It was a beautiful wooden chest, one Eleanor had kept at the foot of our bed. It was filled with things she had called her treasures, seashells from our honeymoon, Leo's first baby booties, a dried flower from our first date. It was a box of pure sentiment, the kind of thing my pragmatic mind had dismissed. I had packed it last and shoved it away first. I knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled among the mementos, was a large, leather-bound book. It was a photo album, but when I opened it, there were no photos. Instead, every page was filled with Eleanor's handwriting. On the first page, in bold letters, it said, "For Leo, a field guide to his night." My breath caught in my chest. I turned the pages, my hands shaking. It was all there. Page after page of observations about me, written for our son. Your knight sometimes gets a stormy look in his eyes when the numbers on his screen are angry. He doesn't mean to be loud. His mind is just fighting a dragon. There was a sketch of me on the phone, a little cartoon dragon breathing fire on a stock chart. The knight shows his love not with hugs, which he finds tricky, but by building the strongest, safest castle for his prince. Another page had a drawing of our house, with Leo and her waving from a tower. She had documented my quirks, my moods, my struggles to connect, and reframed them all through the lens of unwavering love. She hadn't been blind to my failings. She had simply translated them. She had been giving Leo this emotional vocabulary long before Clara ever arrived. The final pages were different. The handwriting was weaker, shakier. It was from her last weeks. "My dearest prince," it began. "The Whispering Queen has to go on a very long journey to the stars. The knight will be very sad for a while. His castle might feel cold, and his voice might be quiet. But his love for you is the sun. Even when you can't see it behind the clouds, it is always there, warm and bright." And on the very last page there was a single sentence. "When you are ready, show him the bird. It will teach him how to sing again." Tears streamed down my face, hot and unchecked, dripping onto the pages. This was the message. This was the final story. It wasn't a secret code. It was a user manual for a broken man, left for our son by the woman who knew us both better than we knew ourselves. She knew Leo would only be ready to share it when he saw that I was ready to receive it, when the knight was finally ready to acknowledge his own sadness. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I took the album and went to Leo's room. He was on the floor lining up his dinosaurs. I sat down opposite him, the book open on my lap. I didn't speak. I just started turning the pages, letting him see the pictures. He stopped what he was doing and crawled over. His small finger traced the drawing of the dragon, then the sketch of our house. He looked from the book to me and back again. For the first time, a flicker of true understanding lit up his eyes. He wasn't just seeing his father, he was seeing his knight. I pointed to the words Eleanor had written about the castle and the sun, and then I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I started to read to him. Not a story about strangers, but our story. His mother's story. My voice was thick with emotion, but I kept going. The house is no longer silent. It's filled with a new kind of sound. Sometimes it's the sound of my voice reading from Eleanor's book. Sometimes it's the sound of Leo's rare but precious words, naming the things in his world. Night, sun, bird. Clara is still with us, but she's no longer a translator. She's more like a guide, helping us navigate this new language we are building together. I still work hard, but my castle doesn't feel so empty anymore. I'm learning that true strength isn't in building walls, but in having the courage to let them crumble. Eleanor left us a map, and Clara, in her infinite wisdom, taught my son how to read it. And in doing so, they gave me the greatest gift of all. They didn't just teach my son how to understand my world. They taught me how to finally, truly enter his.